Hello and welcome. This is Innsbruck Airport, a beautiful small international airport nestled in the Austrian Alps. It is often seen as one of the most difficult and challenging airports pilots can fly into. In fact, the Austrian authorities demand that if you are a real-world pilot and you want to fly an aircraft into this airport, you need to be experienced, you need to undergo a training course and a 2-hour sim assessment, which has to be renewed every 12 months. Only if you meet all these criteria are you allowed to fly into this airport. Now, I have flown in and out of Innsbruck many times, and in this short video series I would like to explain to you why this airport is so challenging, how we operate in and out of it, and how you can emulate this on Microsoft Flight Simulator. Okay, let's get started. I think for most people, when they think of Innsbruck, they would assume that the most difficult approach is this one here, the localizer 26 followed by a circling onto runway 08. And whilst flying wise this is very tricky, I find for me as a pilot, the localizer 26 is actually the one that is way more complex. And it is also the approach that has given me the most grief, and also my colleagues given the most grief, and I'm gonna explain to you why, and why you must never ever underestimate the localizer approach onto runway 26. So let's look at this approach. At first glance it looks fairly straightforward. I mean, we can see down here there's a lot of terrain underneath us, but we have a localizer that will guide us all the way down. First thing of note, you can see here the glide slope is, well, the glide path is 3.8 degrees. That is very steep, and it looks very odd from the flight deck when you come down here. You always feel like you're way too high. So my recommendation before you start this approach from here, make sure you are on flaps 2. That way you are ensuring that the aircraft is not going to accelerate when you fly this approach. If you're clean, forget it. You are not gonna slow down in any meaningful way. Flaps 1, maybe if the aircraft is really light, but ideally make sure you are on flaps 2. The second thing is that we have a go-round here, and you can see here this go-round has to be flown very, very tightly. This needs to be pre-calculated actually, because it gives you here just an example of a 153 knots and a 25-degree bank. What it doesn't say here is you also need to achieve a certain climb gradient, which is something we pre-calculate, because you always assume the worst case scenario when you're a pilot, and that is that you have to perform this go-round, and in the go-round you lose an engine. You still need to be able to get out of this valley here with just one running engine, and so we do all these calculations to ensure that we can always achieve all of this and get everybody out safely out of this valley. And this is where the first tricky bit starts, because what that means is we can usually never ever land with a very heavy aircraft, and that means we are fuel limited. So we're gonna go into this a little bit later with my experience, like the numbers I usually come across, because unfortunately with the Phoenix we lack any of these calculations and softwares that we need to give us all these figures, but I'm gonna give you the figures that we use in the real world and that are usually realistic, so you can sort of play around with the same thing. And if you do that, then very quickly you will see that this becomes a very tricky approach in terms of fuel management. There are not many options for you when it comes to fuel. Another thing, this is just a side note but very important. In order to achieve the climb gradient, you need to fly this with the APU running and the APU bleed on. So what that means is, due to the Airbus logic, the Airbus will then use the APU bleed to climatize the cabin, and therefore we have slightly more power on the engines for the go around. If all that wouldn't be enough already, this approach is not authorized to be flown in lock mode. You can only fly this in nav FPA, which means you have to manually adjust the flight path vector of the aircraft and use the chart to cross-check between your distance and your altitude, once again increasing the workload on the flight deck. There's some other things, but I don't want to bog you down with too many things. We're gonna go through them later on. But yeah, for the time being, just keep in mind, steep approach has to be flown with flaps 2. Make sure the APU is running, and keep this in mind here, because as you can see, you fly to this point here, and if you're not visual, you perform this go around. But what if you carry on, you fly down to the runway, and then you have to perform a go around? What do you do then? So let's look at that. Okay, so here we are in Innsbruck. As you can see, it is a beautiful day. We come into land, and let's say we misjudge the flare. All the landing calculations you will ever do assume that you are going to touch down here in the touchdown zone. Once you go beyond this point here and you haven't touched down, everything that you've calculated is no longer valid, and therefore you have no way of knowing whether there's a safe way of performing this landing, and therefore whenever you go past the touchdown zone, it's an immediate go around. It always has to be. So where do we fly then from here? We cannot perform the turn to the left. You can see we have high terrain. If we lose an engine, this will be fatal. The only way we can go is straight and then to the right, and this is exactly what we have to do. For this, there is something called a balked landing procedure. Now, I wasn't able to find any charts for it, but I'm very impressed with the Phoenix A320 once again, because it actually has this procedure in its database. Let me show you what this procedure roughly looks like. So once you've passed this point here, you need to make a mental note that from now on, if something goes wrong, you cannot fly the go around. You need to fly the balked landing procedure. You need to set this up in the aircraft. We're gonna go through this in a minute. The balked landing procedure essentially means you're gonna fly all the way down this valley. You're gonna turn around, you're gonna fly all the way back, you're gonna fly overhead the airport and then outbound on the localizer, and then you end up back here at this point, Rattenberg. And this brings us to the next problem, and that is fuel. So I've mentioned fuel briefly before because of the length of the runway and all that stuff. So the problem is this balked landing procedure is going to burn an entire ton of fuel by the time you're back in Rattenberg, and this can cause quite a bit of a headache. It's the reason why a lot of aircraft after a balked landing in Innsbruck actually divert and don't try a second time. This has happened to me as well. We tried it once, we failed, we diverted immediately to Munich and landed there. And this is, well, let me go into the aircraft and show you why this can happen. Okay, so we are here in the cockpit, and let's go to mass and balance, and let's go through some figures. During the summer months, the aircraft is usually full. That's great for the company, not so great for us on this airport, because it means the aircraft is very heavy. But most certainly we always have around 180 passengers. We don't usually carry cargo, we usually only carry the bags of the passengers. In the winter this is a bit more because of all the skiing equipment and everything. In the summer it's usually around 1.5 tons. So when it comes to landing weight, again, this is something we calculate. It depends on the temperature, the weather, the wind, everything. But in my experience, Innsbruck, the maximum you can usually expect is something around 65 tons. So what that means is you will arrive here with 5 tons of fuel before you start your first approach. And that seems like a lot, but actually it isn't really. And the problem is you can't take more than this, because once you go past this weight, you're no longer able to fulfill all the criteria in terms of landing distance and of course the climb gradient on the go around, especially if you lose an engine. So let's go through this. We arrive with 5 tons in Rattenberg. We fly an approach which usually takes us down to, let's say, 4,700. That's about realistic. We screw up the flare. We have to fly the bulk landing procedure. That means we lose another ton. We are now down to 3.7. And maybe you can now see where the problem lies. If we divert to Munich, that's another 2 tons. So we need to go down another 2 tons. That takes us here. And this is already very close to the legal limit we can have on the A320. So what you end up with is a situation, if you would fly another approach after a first failed attempt, and this would fail, then you really put yourself in a very, very tight spot, because that would mean you would no longer have the fuel to divert, and you would be absolutely committed to somehow get the aircraft down here in Innsbruck. And Innsbruck is not the kind of airport I want to be committed to. The winds are usually all over the shop, and if you've already done 2 go-rounds, that means the weather is not great. So usually what happens is we fly 1 localizer approach. If we have to do the bulk landing procedure, then we immediately divert to Munich. And then we land there, we assess the situation and decide where we go from here. I've had this happening recently, where we diverted to Munich. We stayed on the ground with the passengers for 1.5 hours. We actually spoke to the tower via our mobile phones, and once they told us the wind and the weather had improved, we filled the aircraft up again to make sure we have the 5 tons by the moment we arrive, and then we tried again. And luckily on the second time we were successful. So this is how this can play out, and this is why the localizer to 6 approach is actually quite tricky, because you have all this stuff going on with the fuel, the bulk landing procedure. You set all of this up in the MCDU, and it makes the workload on the whole approach quite a lot more than, let's say, when you fly into 08, which we actually have fully coded here in the MCDU, and the autopilot can just fly the whole approach. So let's just go through how we set this up on the aircraft and how we would navigate through this approach and the appropriate go-round procedures. Okay, I have fired up the aircraft, and then I'm just gonna talk you through this now. So we are flying from Innsbruck to Innsbruck, because the only thing we're interested right now is the arrival. So the first thing I want to show you is what Phoenix calls the localizer Romeo runway 26 arrival. So we put that in with no star, and if we now go to the plan constraint, we can see the bulk landing procedure. And I'm really impressed that this is in here. So let's just insert that. So if we go through the arrival, we start at Rattenberg, then we come down the localizer. And then from here, if we have to perform a low-level go-round, you have the whole bulk landing procedure. So we fly to this point here, Whiskey India 005. And then we fly outbound, we turn around. You can see here the maximum speed is 165 knots, because you have to stay in this valley. Then we fly back over the airport, out on the localizer, and then directly to Rattenberg. And this is probably why you can see this is gonna burn a whole ton, because it's a very long procedure at fairly low level, high power setting. You're not flying clean because you need to make this turn here at a very low speed, and so yeah, you end up burning a ton by the time you're in Rattenberg. So this is what the aircraft will give you if you choose this approach, but of course there was the other go around, and I don't know why, but it's not coded in the Phoenix A320. So what I'm going to show you now, just to be very clear, would not be allowed in the real world. But you know what, this is a sim. I want you to have a realistic experience, so just follow me and yeah, ignore the regulations for the moment. So first thing I want to do is click on secondary and copy the active. And what that does is, in the secondary we now have the whole bulk landing procedure. Then we go back to the primary, and in the primary I'm gonna change the arrival to localizer 26, because that one does not have a go around in it. In fact, it ends at this point here, and then all it says is manual. So this approach will take you to this point, and from here you have to make your own way to the runway, and if something goes wrong, well, you have to find your own way. And this is what I would use to create this go around here, where we turn around, fly back out on the localizer, and then back to Rattenberg. Okay, so here's how I would set this up. We have this manual here, which is, you know, the go around that doesn't exist. So first we need to create a point here. So Mike Lima 26 is our reference point. We want to turn left. If we look here on nav, I would say 150, yeah, 150 looks about right. And we want this point to be only 1 mile, so somewhere here away from us, so very tight. Put that in here. It's always the closest one, is always at the top. So if we go to plan, this has now created this point here, so we accept that. From here we want to fly to this point here, 90 LOC. So after the point we've just created, we go to 90 LOC. Again, choose the closest. From there we fly outbound on the localizer, and that would take us to Advik, which is out here, Advik. And from Advik we fly to Rattenberg. There we are. And that way you have this tight turn, you fly outbound to Advik, which is where the localizer starts, and then you fly to Rattenberg. We'll put that in for now. Now, in order to make this work, we clear manual, we clear the discontinuity, insert. Blue means go around. So the aircraft understands that what we've just created is a go around. And if we look here, if we zoom in, you can see green, and then the blue is the go around. Again, this is highly illegal. You're not supposed to build your own go arounds in the real world, but this is a sim, and this will make your life a lot easier, because if you perform a go around, the autopilot will automatically fly all of this. Speaking of autopilot, this initial turn we said has to be flown very tightly, so we want to put in a speed constraint. So click here, speed constraint. This would be something you would have to calculate. You're flying the go around with flaps 3, remember? So I think a speed that should always work is 155 knots. So if we put that in here, and then if we go down again to the go around, yes, we can see here now there's a turn and it says 155 knots. And that way the autopilot should fly this nice and tight outbound and then back to Rattenberg. So how does this work in practice? Well, actually fairly easy. It's just a bit of work. You fly the approach, and if you have to perform a go around, you just do what we've just created. Once you go past this point, you're no longer able to fly this go around. And what would happen then is you would do go around, flaps, read the FMA, positive climb, gear up. Then you would go secondary, activate secondary. So that would bring the balked landing procedure. And in order for the aircraft to fly all of this automatically, you go to direct and put the first point ahead of you into the direct and activate. And then the aircraft will go into nav mode and fly the whole thing automatically. So with the balked landing procedure, I would assume, yes, you do the go around and you go direct to Whiskey India 005. You activate this, the aircraft will fly to this point, will go into nav mode and then follow the whole procedure. And that's pretty close to what happens in the real aircraft, to be honest with you. We don't, of course, build our own go-around, but essentially this is what's going on. And then once you've performed the balked landing procedure, have a good think about your situation, about your fuel, and whether you really want to try this again, or whether it's not better to just go to Munich. So, short summary. You switch on the APU with the APU bleed before the approach. You need to fly the approach in nav FPA. This is not a localizer you can fly with lock mode. So you need to do this all manually. You need to cross-check with the chart whether you are too high or too low. Make sure you do proper speed management. It's a very steep approach. Make sure you slow down the aircraft nice and early with gear and everything. And if everything goes well past this point, you know now that if anything goes wrong, you need to activate the secondary flight plan in case of a go-around. Make 100% sure you land in the touchdown zone. This is a very short runway. If you're not in the touchdown zone, it is a go-around. And then, as I said before, secondary, activate secondary, direct to this point, and then the aircraft will fly the go-around. And again, if you don't fly with unlimited fuel or you want to be realistic, do a quick mental calculation whether it is worth trying another one or not. Usually the answer is no. And in that case, go to Munich. You usually require 2 tons to get there, and that will keep you nice and safe in terms of fuel management. So as you can see, there's a lot going on, and this is on a nice day. Imagine now doing this on a day with marginal weather, windy conditions, maybe föhn storm, which is one of the conditions that we encounter here sometimes, where you encounter severe turbulence pretty much the entire approach. Unfortunately, I've also had this already. These are days when I believe an airport worker told me almost 50-60% of all aircraft go around and divert. So really tricky and difficult conditions. So, you know, this is what makes this aircraft so difficult. It's not just the mountains and the terrain, it's everything that comes with it. It's very tricky weather, tricky wind conditions, and because of the go-around procedures that you need to fly and you need to be able to get out of here even on one engine, then you come in with performance limitations, fuel limitations, etc, etc, etc. And all these things are covered in the training course that we perform, and all these things are practiced in the sim, where we fly into marginal weather, we perform a go-around, we lose an engine, and we need to show that we can get the aircraft out safely. So I think this hopefully gives you a bit of an idea why I would say the localizer 2.6 approach is a lot trickier than the 0.8, because on the 0.8, if you fly a go-around, you basically just fly straight out to Rottenberg, and that's it. Very short procedure, doesn't take up a lot of fuel, and there's only one single go-around, and that's it. So none of this switching business here. We'll talk about the 0.8 another day. Today I think we can wrap this up in the practice, and yeah, I have a feeling you actually want to see how this is done, so let's try and fly this approach. Okay, we are turning inbound Rottenberg. I'm gonna start reducing the speed, and of course don't forget we need to start the APU. There we are. Down here the setup is exactly the same as I showed it to you on the ground. I've created my own go around. You can see it here with those points. and in the secondary we have the balked landing procedure. So we're now going to be turning inbound Rattenberg. We need to be at 9,500 feet. After Advik we start the approach, so make sure you are on flaps 2, because as I said before, the approach is very steep. So here we already have the Inntal, the valley we are going to fly into. We can see Innsbruck here at the back. Everything is good. We have a very nice day, just 4 knots of wind. Everything is going great. Okay, we are now inbound Advik. I've slowed down to 180 knots, so let's put down flaps 2. Auto brake is on medium, that's what we always need in Innsbruck. The APU is running, so let's switch on the APU bleed, and everything is slowly but surely getting ready. The approach phase is already armed. As you can see, we need to cross this mountain here, and this is the reason why the localizer is so steep, because we're gonna cross this mountain and then sort of dive down into this valley. At this point, maybe not a bad idea to go back to 170, maybe 160 knots, just so that we have a bit of energy to play with in case the aircraft does decide to speed up. You can see here we are approaching with 4.9 tons, almost 5 tons. That's perfect, because that means we have all the fuel we need for the approach and the balked landing procedure, and still enough for a diversion, or maybe if we're really brave, another approach. Again, like I discussed this earlier with you, this is something you need to think about. Okay, we are now inbound Fox 26, which is where the approach is going to start. I'm going to go to nav FPA. So just before we reach that point, we can already dial in. We need to go down with 3.8. There we are. And then we can slowly but surely adjust. Looks like we're a little bit low. Let's start with 3.6. Here we are. And now we just follow the localizer down. The aircraft is going to use the nav mode to follow the localizer. Well, it's sort of, you know, we're slightly offset, but that's actually like in the real aircraft. It's not very precise. Just use the nav mode and use FPA to make sure you stay on the glide path. So now you would look at your chart, look at the distance and look at the altitude and cross-reference this all the way down. And we're gonna slowly start slowing down the aircraft as we do so. I think we're slowly coming in, so let's go to 3.7. There we are. You can see the aircraft is struggling to hold the speed. This is normal because we're heavy and this is a very steep approach. So if you don't like it, just do what we do in the real world and simply say gear down. Speed is managed, flaps full. We can already see the runway, but let's just follow the approach procedure for now. Okay, it has taken the aircraft a long time to slow down. It is in idle and it's barely able to hold that even with gear down and full flaps. So you can see these steep approaches can be quite tricky. So we are still going down here, we are on track, and as you can see, here comes our point from which onwards we are no longer allowed to fly the go-around procedure but have to do the balked landing procedure. So we are at 3.8, go-around altitude is set, everything is good. You can see the picture looks odd. First of all, we're not flying towards the runway because it's an offset and we're actually quite high up. So you just carry on, you follow the procedure and make sure that you are visual with the runway once you reach this point here. Okay, we're about to pass Mike Lima 26, which means from this point onwards we have to, well, we're either committed or just balked landing. So make a mental note of this, because from now on the go-around procedure is going to change. We're going to switch off the autopilot, and from here on you have to fly manually.
4, 300. 200. 100. 50, 40, 30, 20, retard. 5.
Spoilers, reverse green, decel. Alright, and we've made it into Innsbruck, just making our way to the apron here. So yeah, this was a video that has been requested a few times by people asking me to talk about Innsbruck. So today we covered the localizer 26 arrival. In the next video we'll be looking at the circling approach onto runway 08. Yeah, Innsbruck, one of my favorite airports, as long as the weather, you know, is playing ball. We usually have a layover here. Our hotel is just back there, and then usually I go for nice long walks. I love the city. The city is very beautiful, especially with the surrounding mountains. And I found some really cool places with some yummy food. So yeah, I'm already looking forward to my next layover here. We usually stay here for 24 hours, which is enough time to have a nice wander around and enjoy the scenery. Okay, and with that, that's the end of the video, at least the first part of Innsbruck Airport. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. And I look forward to seeing you again in the next one. Until then, all the best. Bye bye.